What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. The Kremlin is once again rewriting the dictionary of peace and security. Except in Putin's lexicon, these words mean stripping Ukraine of sovereignty, shrinking its army to a Boy Scouts club, and leaving it completely defenseless, while Russia reloads. Western leaders talk about guarantees for Kyiv, while Moscow insists that Russia is the one in need of security guarantees. You see the trick, right? In Putin's world, Ukraine's independence itself is a threat, apparently. That is how twisted this game has become. And the tragic part, some in the West still buy into this rhetorical circus, pretending there is a middle ground between victim and aggressor. Over the last months, we have seen summits in Alaska, Paris and Beijing, with Trump, Macron, Zelensky, Putin and even Xi Jinping, all playing their roles in this theater. But beneath the photo ops and speeches lies the real demand. Putin wants to turn Ukraine into a humiliated state, barred from NATO, capped militarily, and left vulnerable for the next invasion. Meanwhile, 26 nations pledged to provide security guarantees to Ukraine, including troops and weapons, only for Putin to call those forces so-called legitimate targets. Apparently only Russia can have security guarantees, not Ukraine, not the country that is actively being invaded as we speak. So today, let's pull back the curtain. Let's dissect how Putin's version of security guarantees is really just a blueprint for domination. Why NATO expansion drives his paranoia. How Europe scrambles to fill Trump's vacuum. And how this all exposes the hollow core of Kremlin's war strategy. Let's start with Putin's favorite bedtime story, or better say nightmare. NATO expansion. According to the Kremlin, NATO's promise back in 2008 that Ukraine would eventually join the alliance was the single greatest humiliation inflicted on Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. You would think Kremlin was a wounded teenager crying over a breakup letter. For decades, Putin has hammered this narrative, and you already heard it, that the West lied to the Gorbachev, promising NATO would never move east, then they lied to Yeltsin, and now they're lying to the one and only Putin himself. The problem? There was never any binding agreement, nothing. No signed paper, no treaty, absolutely nothing. Just Putin's bitterness over the fact that its former colonies sprinted westward the second they got the chance. This obsession is not about security, it's about empire. NATO did not invade Russia, NATO did not roll tanks into Moscow. What NATO did was welcome countries that were tired of being subordinates. Yet, Putin weaponized this story into grievance so potent that he justifies bombing cities, killing civilians, and annexing land under its banner. He repeats this like a broken record. Security of one country cannot come at the expense of another. But that is exactly the opposite of what he is doing in Ukraine. For him, Ukraine's sovereignty is the expense Russia demands. And here is the most absurd part. Putin pretends like he is fine with Ukraine joining the European Union but not NATO. Why? Because the Brussels may frustrate him economically, but NATO terrifies him militarily. Ukraine in NATO would mean Russia could no longer bully its neighbor with war threats. And for Putin, that is unacceptable. So the security guarantee he wants is really just a guarantee of his future freedom to invade again. Which just once again confirms the fact that if the war is not going to end with the defeat of Putin, he will invade again at some point in the future. It is just a matter of time. The only security he cares about is his empire's ability to expand without resistance. Now let's talk about the most outrageous demand the Kremlin ever dares to present. If banning NATO was not enough, Moscow now wants Ukraine to nurture its own military. This is where things get even more ridiculous. In Istanbul peace talks last year, Russia floated conditions that would cap the size of Ukraine's armed forces and dictate the type of weapons Kyiv could use and own. Translation: disarm yourself so we can rest, rearm, learn from our mistakes, and then, at some point, come back later. Meanwhile, Ukraine itself has been pouring resources into building its own domestic defense industry, developing new drones by themselves, missiles, and armor to avoid dependence on Western pipelines. Kyiv's strategy is brutally simple. If the world will not guarantee us, we will guarantee ourselves. That makes sense. But that directly clashes with Moscow's demand. Russia does not want a strong, independent Ukraine. It wants a weak neighbor who cannot even dream of reclaiming occupied territories, let alone deter the next invasion. This is not just about tanks or troops numbers anymore. It's psychological warfare. A nation forced to cap its army is a nation told, guys, you're too weak to decide your own future, so let us handle it. Putin knows this. He wants to grind Ukraine down into submission, but not just physically, also mentally. And yet, Western analysts still sometimes frame this as a reasonable compromise. I mean, no, it's not. Wake up, people. It is the equivalent of asking a burglary victim to deinstall their locks, leave the door wide open, disable security because, hey, what if the thief feels unsafe and has to work extra hard to overcome these challenges the next time he wants to steal something? What if he even injures himself? Because no amount of person's suffering is worth any material things. This is how ridiculous it is. But Ukraine sees right through this nonsense. Zelensky has rejected these conditions outright, as he should, calling them what they are: capitulation disguised as negotiation. And he's right. Because what Russia really fears is not Ukraine's offensive, it is Ukraine's survival. As long as Ukraine exists, it can always fight back. We briefly also touched Europe earlier in today's video, so guys, now let's talk in more details about its response to ongoing events and statements that are being made, because this is very important. While Russia demands Ukraine to tie its own hands, Europe has tried to offer alternatives. Enter Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, ever the dramatist, promising reassurance forces from 26 nations ready to deploy the moment the guns fall silent. The idea sounds kinda bold. Troops stationed by sea, land or air to deter Russia from trying round 2. But Putin instantly shot back. Any foreign troops in Ukraine would be legitimate targets, even the peacekeepers, his little quote. Not that it ever stopped him sending his own peacekeepers to Crimea and Georgia, but anyways. You can almost hear the smirk as he said it, daring Europe to test him. But here's the problem. Europe is acting like a family trying to protect a child, while the father figure, Trump, is flirting with the abuser. European leaders rushed to Washington after Trump's Alaska summit with Putin, terrified that he would sell Ukraine out. They wanted guarantees, commitments, clarity. What they got was Trump boasting about his great relationship with Putin, while admitting he is disappointed because thousands are still dying. I mean, just disappointed, as though this was some kind of a bad business deal, not a literal genocidal war, the biggest one since Second World War in the entire European continent. This left Europe scrambling. Some pledged troops, some offered training and weapons, others like Germany and Italy denied even the idea of their own boots on the ground, but instead they prefer financing and training Ukraine's army from a safe distance, which is basically what is happening right now. Europe wants to look united, but the cracks are unfortunately showing, and Putin loves it. He feeds on those cracks. Every hesitation, every delay, every diplomatic hedge is another opening for Moscow to claim that the West is divided. Meanwhile, Trump's indecisiveness becomes Putin's leverage. The US president teases talks, praises Putin's constructive efforts, and then just shrugs and says maybe America should just focus on crime and inflation at home, because America first. Our own problems require solutions. Europe cannot strangle Russia economically without Washington. Sanctions lose power if the world's biggest economy looks away, and Putin knows it. So while Macron hugs Zelensky for the cameras, the Kremlin bets on Trump's passiveness to weaken the whole Western front. At the end of the day, Russia's so-called security guarantees boil down to one thing: time. Time to keep fighting, time to keep annexing, time to wait for the West to fracture. That is why Putin rejects ceasefires without a full peace deal. He knows that freezing the conflict now would lock in territorial losses that Kyiv still dreams of reversing. So he plays hardball. No ceasefire until Ukraine gives up its land, its NATO dreams, and its army's strength. Look at the theater of him even inviting Zelensky to talk in Moscow of all places, as if the victim should come kneel before the aggressor in his palace. We, by the way, guys, made the entire video about it yesterday, so please go ahead and watch it if you missed it as well after watching this video. Putin's spokesperson Peskov calls it an invitation, not a capitulation. But everyone sees the absurdity. Kyiv laughed it off, calling it proof that Moscow is not serious. Neutral cities like Geneva or Ankara were proposed. But Putin insists still on home turf. Why? Because for him negotiations are not about compromise. They are about humiliation. At the same time, Russia's demands to be one of Ukraine's security guarantors. Let that sink in. The fox not only wants to guard the henhouse, it wants to have a bed inside of it. The absurdity would be laughable if it was not soaked in blood. Because while these diplomatic games unfold, Russia keeps shelling cities, advancing along front lines, and burning through its own economy at enormous speed. Sanctions are finally biting, with the Central Bank of Russia itself warning of stagflation and stagnation. But the Kremlin just hides behind war artificial growth numbers like a gambler clutching his last chips. And still, Putin tells his people there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe he's right, but that light is an oncoming train and it's heading straight for Russia's future. Ukraine does not need Russia's guarantees. Ukraine needs the world's commitment to ensure Moscow never again confuses domination with security. Because the second they accept Putin's terms, Ukraine's sovereignty dies, and the blueprint for future invasion is written in stone. That is the truth behind the Kremlin's so-called security guarantees. They are not at all a path to peace. They are a trap. And the world better see it before it's too late. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. If you want to see an additional chapter at the end of each episode, it will be uploaded to my Patreon. The link is down below. The best way to support my work through the memberships. Thanks much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.